After years of legal battles, Marvin Lee Wilson was executed by lethal injection in the state of Texas on August 7, 2012. This was a fiercely controversial case, not only because of the nature of the crime, but also because Marvin Lee Wilson's intelligence test results showed an IQ of 61, a figure below the threshold considered for intellectual disability, according to rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court. In this video, we will explore the last meal he chose and the final words he spoke before his life ended. The case began on the night of November 10, 1992, in the 1500 block of Verone in Beaumont, Texas. A physical confrontation occurred between Marvin Lee Wilson and 21-year-old Jerry Robert Williams. Williams was a police informant on drug matters, and he had caught Wilson selling cocaine. This confrontation quickly escalated into a horrifying act of violence. Wilson abducted Williams and then shot him to death. This was not a quick and clean death, but a brutal act that demonstrated Wilson's coldness and cruelty when faced with the risk of being exposed. After murdering Jerry Robert Williams, Marvin Lee Wilson dumped the victim's body at a bus stop. Williams's body was later discovered by a bus driver. The crime scene, while not having as many shocking details as others, showed a disregard for human life and a recklessness in Wilson's decision to dispose of the body in a public place. Evidence gathered at the scene, along with information from drug enforcement officials, quickly pointed the investigation toward Marvin Lee Wilson. Jerry Robert Williams, the victim of the case, was only 21 years old when he was murdered. Although there is not much detailed information about Williams's family background or childhood, his role as a police informant on drug matters suggests he faced difficulties and dangers in his life. He had entered a high-risk environment where disclosing information could mean facing brutal retaliation. Williams's death, a tragic and undeserved end, robbed a young man of his future and left his family with inconsolable pain. He was part of the war on drugs, and the price he paid was far too high. Marvin Lee Wilson, born January 5, 1958, had a rather troubled past. Before the murder of Jerry Robert Williams, Wilson had 2 prior convictions for robbery, one of which was an aggravated robbery. This indicated he was an individual with violent tendencies, who had repeatedly broken the law. These prior convictions painted a picture of a man with behavioral control issues, who was likely familiar with the criminal world. However, the most notable point about Wilson's history was his intellectual state. Experts determined Wilson's IQ to be 61, a score below the threshold for intellectual disability. This raised a major question about his cognitive ability and criminal responsibility, especially since U.S. law had established that individuals with intellectual disabilities should not be executed. Could a person with such a low IQ truly understand the severity of his actions? The murder of Jerry Robert Williams took place after a direct confrontation over Wilson's cocaine dealing. This was a crime with a clear motive, revenge, and eliminating a threat. After abducting Williams, Wilson coldly shot the victim to death. This act was not just an impulsive reaction, but also showed calculation to conceal his drug trafficking activities. Dumping the body at a bus stop indicated a lack of thought about the consequences, or perhaps a complete disregard for the victim's life. The investigation and arrest of Marvin Lee Wilson happened quite quickly. With evidence from the crime scene and information from drug investigators, police rapidly identified Marvin Lee Wilson as the prime suspect. Although there are no detailed accounts of Wilson's reaction upon arrest, his placement on death row on May 9, 1994, shows the case was clear enough to convict him of murder. The trial and sentencing of Marvin Lee Wilson became the center of a legal controversy. On May 9, 1994, Wilson officially entered death row. Although experts presented evidence of his IQ score of 61, a number that should have made him ineligible for the death penalty under the U.S. Supreme Court's Atkins v. Virginia ruling, which prohibits executing the intellectually disabled, the state of Texas successfully used the specific details of the crime to argue against this. Texas contended that although Wilson's IQ was low, his actions in the crime, such as kidnapping, shooting, and disposing of the body, demonstrated that he had sufficient awareness to commit the crime purposefully. This opened a loophole in the law, allowing states like Texas to use community standards to determine intellectual disability, rather than relying solely on standardized IQ tests. Wilson's appeals journey was fraught with difficulties. In December 2005, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit ruled that because Wilson's lawyers had missed a filing deadline, he could not file further appeals in federal court. This was a major blow to Wilson's hopes, illustrating the severe limitations that the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act (AEDPA) imposes on the appeal rights of death row inmates, sometimes stripping them of the opportunity to have their sentences reviewed for errors. However, on March 10, 2006, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals unexpectedly granted Wilson permission to file an appeal, citing rare and exceptional circumstances to bypass the filing deadline. This decision brought a new glimmer of hope for Wilson. But the journey remained arduous. Despite his appeals and the evidence of his low IQ, Marvin Lee Wilson was still executed. He was held at the Ellis Unit and later moved to the Alan B. Polonsky Unit, one of Texas's largest death row facilities, before being taken to the Huntsville Unit for his execution. Wilson's case, particularly his execution despite his low IQ, sparked a wave of strong opposition. Organizations like the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty voiced criticism, highlighting that Wilson's case illustrated how the AEDPA severely limited the ability of death row inmates to appeal their sentences to determine if they were being held unconstitutionally. The final hours of Marvin Lee Wilson were a moment filled with tragedy and poignancy, especially when looking back at later legal developments. On August 7, 2012, in the 24 hours before his execution, Wilson spent his last moments in isolation at the Polonsky Unit. He was allowed final phone calls and visits with his lawyer and relatives. Witnesses described Wilson's mood in his final hours as unusually calm, an acceptance of his fate after years of appeals. He had a final meeting with the warden to review the execution procedures. This psychological state is often explained as a breakdown or absolute acceptance after a long and hopeless legal battle. For his last meal, Marvin Lee Wilson requested a fairly simple meal. It was recorded that he chose a bacon cheeseburger with jalapenos and spicy sauce, accompanied by French fries, mashed potatoes, and a glass of orange juice. This choice, a familiar fast food-style meal, could speak to a desire for a bit of normalcy, a final small comfort in the worst of times. It was not an elaborate or deeply symbolic meal, but purely a personal choice, perhaps reminiscent of past meals, memories of a free life, before the death sentence became a reality. It is a small detail, yet one of the last traces of humanity in an incredibly harsh environment. When brought into the execution chamber at the Huntsville Unit, Texas, Marvin Lee Wilson was asked for his last words. However, unlike many other death row inmates with long or philosophical speeches, Wilson simply said, "I am ready." This statement, delivered calmly, almost indifferently, stunned many witnesses. It could be interpreted as a complete acceptance of death, or as a lack of full awareness of what was happening due to his intellectual state. For those who believed in Wilson's intellectual disability, these words reinforced their belief that he could not truly comprehend the nature of the death penalty and the crime he had committed. After he spoke, the lethal injection process was carried out quickly and Marvin Lee Wilson was pronounced dead at 6:27 p.m. on August 7, 2012. The death of Marvin Lee Wilson ignited a fierce legal and ethical debate, especially since experts had determined his IQ to be 61. Opponents of the death penalty used Wilson's case as evidence of the system's injustice and the execution of individuals with limited cognitive abilities. However, the state of Texas defended its position, arguing that IQ was not the sole factor in determining intellectual disability, and that Wilson was still responsible for his actions. However, later developments changed the legal landscape. In 2014, 2 years after Wilson's execution, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Hall v. Florida that the Constitution forbids states from applying a rigid IQ score like a threshold of 70 to determine intellectual disability. This paved the way for reviewing similar cases. Then, in 2017, in Moore v. Texas, the Supreme Court further ruled that states could not use community standards or non-clinical factors, as Texas had done with Wilson, to assess intellectual disability. States must rely on current medical standards. These rulings mean that if Marvin Lee Wilson had been tried after 2014 and 2017, he likely would not have been sentenced to death. His case became a prime example of the evolution of law and ethics concerning the death penalty, especially for those with cognitive impairments. Wilson's death was not in vain. It contributed to changing how the U.S. court justice system treats similar cases in the future, ensuring that intellectually disabled individuals are protected from the death penalty. It stands as a costly lesson about the delays of justice and the tragic consequences they can cause